Thank you so much. I see the hands and.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We didn't see the claps. Why is anyone not clapping? Wow. Oh, yes. Thank you. Any more claps, hearts? Wow, this was beautiful. A heart for me. Another one, another one, another one, another one. Thank you so much, Bobby, for sharing that item. Art is one of the most important instruments of fighting, of calling upon change, and seeking for transformation, because we want our bodies to feel something. As we feel something, we act. It's also just like thinking. So thank you for sharing that item. I'll just give you an opportunity to speak to the song, the recording process, and also just about today's theme. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mbali. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad actually to be part of this group, the Travelers Group, and to be part of UNISA, and to be part of a thinking that is not streamlined towards the way we do education in the universities. So I'm actually glad to see this traction happening. I wish that there could be more of these kinds of interaction where we actually learn, but we are talking. I'm not much of a singer. Actually, I'm not even a singer. I play guitar actually. So what had happened was, after seeing the call, for invite from Mbali, I then thought, no, let me just share something also, and perform today and try and sing. The selection of songs was very difficult for me, and the reason why it was difficult is because there's a huge body of artistry, of music that has been happening since the apartheid times, since the colonial times, in South Africa, that has been released. And Initially, I thought I was going to choose my own song, but I just scrapped that away. I thought, let me just do a song that everyone knows. And the reason why specifically I chose this song was because of the message it carries, and how it aligns with today's theme. Um, Coming from South Africa and coming from a community where we have moved on, I feel that there still needs to be platforms and discourses like these ones where we talk about how did we get here? Why are we here? You know, who are we as a people? You know, who laid the foundation for us to be here today? And that song then, you know, was so very much relevant because it speaks to the people that have laid the foundation uh, for us to find ourselves where we are today. And it speaks about people being comfortable, and they've now forgotten about where they are coming from, and you know, they just don't care anymore. So I feel that the song was very much relevant because it is a reminder, you know, a constant reminder for us when we listen to it, that we need to look back and then, you know, look within us as well, and acknowledge, you know, what the people that have laid the foundation for us have done, what they've sacrificed for us. And it was so much very relevant and profound in a way, you know, for me to then, you know, perform this song. So yeah, I'm so very much glad to be part of this the travelers today. And yes, that's my piece. And thanks. Over to you, Mbali.
Thank you so much, Bobby. Thank you so much, Bobby, for that contextualization and also just giving us background. I think you touched on a very interesting point. You said that you appreciate this platform because it presents different ways of learning. That is very key for decoloniality, because as we learn in different ways, and we learn in different platforms that are not traditional or not, you know, rigid to how we know education and how we engage with education. I think it was Professor Shabangu who said that who is also one of the people who helped with the conceptualization of this module. She said that the most meaningful learnings that she has learned that have affirmed her are those that are not within the university but outside of the university. And I think that is very key. And also thank you so much for reminding us of, you know, what is in our musical library as people. Music that confronts coloniality, music that speaks truth to power, and music that reminds us that we shouldn't be sleeping, we should awake to and imagine a reality and a world anew. So we'll move to the next item of our program, which is introducing our guest today, Dr. Sibonile Mphendukana, sorry, and I will hand over to him after I read his bio. So Dr. Sibonile Mphendukana has a PhD in linguistics and is currently employed as a lecturer at the Department of African Languages and Linguistics at the University of Cape Town. His research and publications focus on linguistic landscape, the contestation of space, race, and language, visual semiotics, and material ethnography. His specific research interests are in the nuisance of place, semiotic language, and race in the post-1994 era, and his central focus is on the ways in which place is a salient semiotic dynamic in different evolving semantic and semiotic performances of race. His PhD used the work of Frantz Fanon as a perspective to anchor and analyze of an analysis of semiotic material deployed by students during the hashtag Shackville protest at the University of Cape Town in 2016, which he was a part of. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Mphendukana. Welcome. The floor is yours. Dr. Mphendukana, are you still here with us?
Yes.
Yebo. Thank you so much for choosing to be with us today, choosing to travel with us on this topic of coloniality of race. We are very excited and humbled and also very grateful that you are here with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I think one of the challenges for me with regards to the topic, I think it's a very meaty topic, and I think 30 minutes is not enough for me to be able to articulate very well what this may mean. And I teach there's a course that I teach, which is language and race, which again, I mean, kind of talks to some of the themes, and we use, I think, the work of Maldonado Torres and Fanon to kind of understand language from a very materialist perspective as Africans in Africa and in South Africa, particularly in the Western Cape, to be able to make sense, around issues of speaking, around issues of not speaking, around issues of audibility being understood, and all of these things, and how this carries implications for language speakers. So that's generally the perspective that I'll be speaking from in trying to make sense of the coloniality of race. And I particularly kind like of the idea of Zizek, who speaks of the prison house of language, to make sense of how language in its very essence, is the very modality that we use to make sense of some of the problems and the complexities around, which we need to articulate. For example, the issues of decoloniality and all of that. And for Africans, as linguists, have kind of grappled with the kind of idea that a lot of African languages are inventions of colonialists, from the orthography and developing, the dictionaries and developing the labeling of languages, which today we assume and we say, I am this and that. And that, of course, that intersects with how we have developed, cultural identities such as Xhosa, Zulu, and all of this. And as problematic as that, because the conceptualization and the creation of those languages was not necessarily things that we created ourselves. Because a lot of isiXhosa speakers don't know that it was a white missionary that developed the writing system of isiXhosa, So for me today, I just want to speak a little bit of, in terms of understanding ourselves, within the rubric of colonialism. How do we then epistemically engage each other, as people, and how do we hear each other into speech? Because there is a sense in which there are ways of speaking that are more audible than others. And how do we speak each other into hearing, to be able to be receptive to certain ideas that come from people that are otherwise not known to speak. And I think the issue should not be, can the subaltern speak, in the Spivak sense, but how do we decipher, voices and multiple utterances, that kind of move away from, hegemonic discourses. So that's the essence of what I want to speak to, understanding, of course, the coloniality of being as the essence, because we need to understand language as embodied, which is why we understand that somebody can carry the kind of right accent and the wrong body. They can carry the right body and the wrong accent, because we are dealing with the politics of audibility and being understood. So in essence, really, as a starting point, of course, I think Fanon is really important, because I think Lewis Gordon writes a lot about, why Fanon begins with, the Negro as and language on black skins, white mask, because there is an understanding of language as a medium and its implication and the politics around, the colonized bodies versus the colonizer in terms of at the point of encounter, who is speaking and who is not speaking. So, Fanon theorizes about language and affect. And how do people feel about that? And it theorizes around language and the body, in terms of who gets to speak. And then again, the place, of where do we speak from? And as Uzandi said, talking about the locus of enunciation. And he spends a lot of time in that chapter talking about how, for example, blackness is positioned. And in some of the work that I write about, it goes to the essence of violence that we experience, that if you deprive people of an outlet in which to scream, around violence, then they deal with this idea of politics of proximity. So the outlet becomes the next person, which is why we deal within the township space, for example, with a lot of violence, because there's nothing really that is happening around that. And of course, that in itself, kind of speaks to the formation of subjectivities, and what is human and what is not to be human. So I kind of want to frame this within, the colonial ethos of racialization, language, speaking, and knowledge. And then we kind of gravitate towards interrogating the idea of being, in terms of the coloniality and how coloniality frames these kind of notions. So one of the things that makes Fanon quite an important person in the theorization around coloniality, language, body, and space is the locus of enunciation, because he's writing from a very particular perspective, and he writes as a colonized human being, and he writes against the grain. And his writing is really informed by his own reality. And I think he makes quite a telling statement, which I think is helpful, because he locates the human as central in making society. So when he says, society, unlike biochemical processes, cannot escape human influences. Man is what brings society into being. And if we understand that particular statement in terms of the coloniality which presides over how societies were created and how Africa, occupies a very particular position, and what today we have termed as, global South and global North, in terms of the experiences that, not locations per se, but I think of this a lot more in terms of the experiences of colonialism, which affects how Africa today is framed and how Africa continues to operate. And I think a big reminder for us was during COVID-19, where we could see how then, power still kind of operates within the same logics as it operated during colonialism. And it is helpful also to understand, as the basis of this thinking, people like Stuart Hall, who kind of theorize around, the idea of the West and the rest. And to understand for us we use that to understand the creation of the other in colonialism. And for us to do that, we must understand the creation of the West. And I think, it's Stuart Hall who says the idea of the West, once produced, became productive in its turn. It had real effects. It enabled people to know or to speak of certain things in certain ways. It produced knowledge. It became both the organizing factor in a system of global power relations and the organizing concept or term in a whole way of thinking and speaking. And I think even today, and again, I mean, I return to this idea, this example of COVID-19 and the kind of reporting that we got to experience, and the fear mongering that came. We saw what happened in Spain, and I think we saw images of what happened in Italy and the rest of Europe, really. But when it came to Africa, it was kind of framed in a very different way, and it was kind of the end of the world. How are we going to kind of engage with that? And when South Africa discovered one of the variants of the COVID-19, and it became what they labeled as the South African kind of thing. And again, you can see the dynamics that Stuart Hall speaks about, in terms of how these global power relations manifest in that kind of logic, where something that emanates and is discovered in the global South is kind of very dismissed, and is treated with suspicion. And I think when I get to Maldonado Torres's idea of the coloniality of being, then we begin to see these connections that speak to these kind of ideas. And one author for me, an anthropologist, Michel Rolf-Trulot, who writes, very much in terms of, from the anthropological perspective, particularly the methodologies and the ways of thinking and the ideas and the theorization that are quite prevalent in that particular field of study. And he remarks that in creating the West, the European Renaissance shaped a global geography of imagination. That geography required a savage slot, a space for inherently other. A Martinician author, which is what Eduardo Glissant writes, that the West is not the West. It is a project, not a place. So once we understand these dynamics, that we are not really dealing about a particular location, but we are dealing, about a project. We are dealing with a project. We are dealing with ideas that inform that particular thinking. And indeed, the place we most often call the West is best called North Atlantic, not only for the sake of geographical precision, but also because such usages frees us to emphasize that the West is always a fictitious exercise in global legitimation. And this idea, I think, for me, speaks to, we need to understand how globalization as an offshoot of colonialism continues to drive the very same patterns of thinking and the same patterns of doing. Now, then where does language, for me as a linguist, feature in that? Because again, I mean, language is such an important tool in thinking about these things. Even when we're thinking about decoloniality, I think Professor Pra, when the student of UCT, Rhodes Must Fall, we're speaking about these things, made a remark that he is yet to understand, he's yet to hear how what we mean, the students meant at the time, when we talk about decolonization in relation to language and understanding the power of language in terms of articulating some of these ideas. And Fanon is not different from that, because he locates language at the epicenter of comprehension of the dimensions of the other. So when we think about the other, language becomes quite an important thing, because for it is implicit that to speak is to exist absolutely for the other. Now, when we speak English only, what is it that we are generating ourselves? And we understand, and I think in Black Skins, White Mass as well, when there's that example of César, Aimé César, when they mentioned that he speaks French better than the Frenchman. And I think we also, even today, I mean, I think in my timeline, there's a guy, I think Mustole, his name, he speaks this, very fancy English, and he's homeless. And again, I mean, there's kind of sympathy that generates, because we are shocked when people understand and speak in English in that particular way, and we already, put them at a particular kind of, class level, and therefore they should not be poor. They should not be suffering because they speak this English. And I think Spanon drives a similar point, because when we talk about the coloniality of being, we speak about it from the perspective of language and its importance. What does it mean not to speak colonial languages? Then we get a very different picture. We get a very different image, because that carries very materialist kind of perspectives. You can be the smartest person, you can be the most industrious person, but if you do not speak one of the colonial languages, whether be it Spanish, whether be it Portuguese, whether be it English, you do not have the same opportunities in terms of the politics of mobility as someone who speaks only English as a monolingual speaker. So what is implied by that is that to speak is to be open, to face the other. So when we are engaging in this kind of dialogic experience, we are being open to understand how coloniality affects us, and how colonialism continues to preside many of, over many of these things that we still grapple with today. So, and this idea also points to this kind of, symbiosis, this kind of dual flow, which also implicate the idea of not speaking. What does it mean when we do not speak? So Maldonado Torres, makes the distinction between colonialism and coloniality. And I think that is quite a fundamental intervention, because it helps us understand that coloniality is a continuation of the institutionalization of colonialism through, continuities of how we speak, even the university itself, what we understand the university to be, and what is the role of universities. Those are all part of what Lewis Gordon calls, the grammar of receding empires, because he makes the argument that when colonialists left, they didn't leave entirely, but they left, part of their grammars behind, through institutions, through how we engage with politics, through how we engage with a lot of things in society. So for us to understand the coloniality of being, which is a philosophical and historical exposition, we first need to understand what Maldonado Torres means by coloniality. So it is crucial then to first understand colonialism as a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such nations an empire. So this is quite significant, because it really communicates the overt external influence or taking over of a country by another country. Now, coloniality then is something that's slightly different, because he explains it as something that refers to long-standing patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, that define labor, that define intersubjective relations and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. Now, anybody who's in the university space will understand the dichotomy of the North-South kind of dialogue. We still thrive, we still wish to be accepted and acknowledged by Northern universities. We still find a lot of, our pride in going to Oxford, in going to Harvard versus going to Makerere University. And that in itself, is because of understanding this coloniality and understanding ourselves as part of coloniality, as products of colonialism. And now, what we have to also understand is the violence that comes with that idea. So Maldonado Torres's theorization is kind of taking this idea of violence as part of that grammar, and how that shapes modern society, and how it defines what is the norm and what is not the norm, and how it defines the colonizer and the colonized. And again, one thing which for me is also quite interesting is this very intentional and deliberate kind of way not to implicate the colonizer in our discourses. We kind of want to move away. We are so much in a hurry not to kind of point these out in terms of speaking about them in ways that create discomfort for people that continue to benefit from colonialism. So this idea builds again on the Fanonian ideas and themes. So we see what Ndlovu speaks of as the logic of violence in coloniality and its production of African subjectivities. And I think Mbembe, in the critique of reason, also arrives to the kind of, very similar themes. And I think I speak to that, in the next slides. So, and what Maldonado Torres does on the coloniality of being is very much similar to what Fanon does, in Black Skins and White Mask, because, the theorization of the, antagonistic worlds that Fanon presents, where there's a colonized world and there's a colonizer's world. So Maldonado Torres brings our attention to what he terms as the Manichaean misanthropic skepticism. And that is a pervasive doubt about the other's humanity, their languages and their knowledge. And we can all agree in this particular platform that as Africans, we have to work tenfold to be able to prove that we are human, to be able to prove that we can produce things, to be able to prove that we can produce and speak in languages that are our own. And not language in terms of the narrow sense, you know, on the narrow categorizations of language where it's English, just Xhosa. No. I'm speaking about language in a very holistic kind of idea, where it includes embodiment of language. And if you understand, you know, when I spoke earlier about, you know, having the right accent and the wrong body, we have many examples, you know, that some you might be aware of where, for example, somebody is looking for a place to rent, particularly in our case in Cape Town, and because they went to the good schools, you know, they speak the posh English, they've got the accent, they call in, you know, but on the day that they are doing the viewing, suddenly everything falls apart because now your appearance is not the correct appearance that links to that particular language that you had spoken over the phone. And this is what Lewis Gordon speaks as of as illicit of appearance, where, you know, your presence in a particular place is not something that is expected. And again, I mean, the knowledges that we have, there's a lot of dismissing of what we call African indigenous knowledge systems. And then there's a lot of suspicion that comes with somebody who wants to operate from that particular kind of perspective. And one of the most interesting things, which again, I mean, I say this a lot to people that I interact with, you know, today we are encouraged to recycle. But if you go back a little bit and you say, you know, what did our grandmothers do when, you know, the white madam was throwing away the stuff, you know, that they didn't want to use at home? We repurposed a lot of that material and we put it to good use. And issues like, you know, organic, you know, chicken, you know, this is the way that in which we have done things, but now they are given new labels. And again, this undermines the knowledge systems that we have. And there's a lot of indigenous medications that is getting, you know, sold from many, you know, reputable pharmacies now. And these are things that we've always had, you know, within our systems of knowledge and our systems of being. So in many ways, you know, this also, you know, these ideas, you know, speak to the themes that emerge in Fanon's work, and you know, and it also kind of implicates the imperialist view that seeks to justify violence, which, you know, presides over these relations. So if you are not human, if you don't have a language, if you don't have knowledge, then you are begging for me in a way to kind of come and share and teach you, you know, new ways of being. So, and the first part of the paper on the coloniality of being by Maldonado Torres, you know, lists three kind of contributions to the understanding of coloniality and race. The first one is the understanding of race as a misanthropic skepticism, you know, where we understand race in terms of, you know, its racializations. You know, what does it mean in a very materialist sense to be a black person and to occupy space? The interrelation of race and gender. And I think that there's a lot to be said there. You know, what does it mean to exist as a black man and what does it mean to exist as a black woman? And the third part is the understanding of race and gender conceptions in modernity as a result of naturalization of what he calls the ethics of war. Now, in the encounter of colonialism, there is what he calls the ethics of war. And I might be wrong in this, but I think in Black Skins, White Masks, Fanon makes a point that the black person is without ethics. And that is to say that there is no ethics for black people. When we are engaging black people, we are not engaging with what is called the human, and therefore there is no ethics. And Maldonado Torres extends this idea when he speaks about what he calls the ethics of war. Now, what kind of ethics happens in the process of subjugations of people? So the lived experience of racialized people is deeply touched by the encounter with misanthropic skepticism and by the constant encounter with death and violence. So the ethics of war articulate the idea that we do not enjoy the same sympathy as that of the colonizer because we are racialized beings. And there is no better case, you know, in the world than to see how the establishment, the system, whether the system is operated by black people or is operated by white people, but it kind of have very similar or very resonating kind of experiences. I think the US give us very chilling examples of how, black people, get killed by the police. In South Africa, you see similar things, your Andristatanes, you see, the Marikana miners, you see a lot of these, and you see the brutalization of students during the Fees Must Fall, Rose Must Fall kind of protest. But then when there was Zuma Must Go kind of protest, and then you see a very different logic, because now there's more white people in that. And I think this idea of the ethics of war, is the starting point for us to be able to understand how the formation of subjectivities translate materially and experientially for people. Now, Maldonado Torres describes the coloniality of being as hellish existence in the colonial world, which carries with it both the racial and the gendered aspects of the naturalization of non-ethics of war. Indeed, coloniality of being primarily refers to the normalization of the extraordinary events that take place in war. Now, what happens to captives of war? That is the question that perhaps we need to engage with. What happens to captives of war, particularly the war of subjugation? So there are no ethics that are afforded to colonized being. He is instead a subject of sadistic violence. And without an outlet, without any kind of sense for them to be able to find language to express and articulate these kind of things, because we are dealing with issues of inaudibility. This is why when during Fees Must Fall, in any kind of situation, even in kind of decolonial scholarship, in conferences, there's a particular way that we need to speak as Black scholars that is palatable and that is making people comfortable for us, for them to hear us, when we articulate the rage of Blackness. And if you transgress and articulate that particular perspective, you kind of get into all sorts of trouble, because you have to maintain your position as a kind of like a reservoir of sadistic violence, as it were. Now, so Maldonado Torres develops this point and makes an assertion that this is attributed to the failure and limitations of what he calls the Cartesian formulation, which means that that occupied modern European thoughts and philosophy. And again, I want to explain that in terms of the basis of implication. When Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am," there's a complexity in that statement, because we are led to a more complex and both philosophical and historical expression. Because when you say "I think," the implication is that others do not think, or do not think properly. When you say that "therefore I am," that means others are not. So there's a lack of being there, the zone of non-being, as Fanon calls it, and Lewis Gordon. So therefore you should not exist, or you are very much dispensable. And these kind of ideas, of course, are still part of the grammar of how we articulate the sense of being in this world and how we occupy it. So the Cartesian formulation privileges epistemology, which is knowledge, which simultaneously hides both what could be regarded as coloniality of knowledge, and which, the implication there is others do not think, and the coloniality of being, where there's a denial of a sense of the fullness of human being, or the status of human being, as far as that kind of idea is concerned. And this is the point that Maldonado Torres makes in that paper. But now, what does it mean for us, to kind of make sense? Because, okay, again, colonialism is not experienced in the same way. There's resonance to what, the South Americans and the Caribbean people experience. But these themes also emerge from, very, global South Africa in particular. And Mbembe kind of gets into this kind of debate as well in the critique of reason, critique of Black reason, because he has this statement, the way he says, as object of discourse and objects of knowledge, Africa and Blackness have, since the beginning of modern age, plunged the theory of the name, as well as the status and function of the sign and of representation, into a deep crisis. The same was true of the relation between being and appearance, truth and falsehood, reason and unreason, even language. Now, what Mbembe speaks to is that Africa occupies a very peculiar kind of idea. And within our scholarship, we know that, you know, it's very common for global North universities to come and mine data, you know, in South Africa or in any African country, and then go and produce, you know, the papers from the North, and they publish and they write about Africa and speak about Africa in a very kind of problematic ways, and articulate and become experts, you know, that study Africa while they are not located within this. And I think this is what Mbembe brings to the discussion here. Now, then, is there a situation where we can go beyond this? I'm trying to finish this, and I'm hoping that I have made sense, and I've tried to connect the dots about, you know, what is this coloniality of being that we are speaking about, and the relation, again, I mean, language as a modality to be able to make sense of that. Now, Brooks, there's a you know, has this concept of what he calls the fugitive listening. And what does it mean to speak to? What does it mean to listen to people whose voices are inaudible, whose languages are not understood? You know, and he theorizes this idea of fugitive listening as a mode of engagement that attends to sonic practices that refuse the given ground of representation. It is a mode of listening to those who are cast into the abyss of non-being, you know, the subaltern in the Spivak sense, and the undercommons, you know, as per Hani and Morton, whose silence is made possible, if not expected. So blackness operates within that kind of logic, you know, that, you know, there's a possibility you need to create comfort for people, and whose words are not heard at all, you know. So, and the undercommons is a situation characterized by inaudibility and regulation, where you have to constantly be corrected. You know, if it's not your accent, it's your pronunciation. If it's not your pronunciation, it's your English. I mean, we deal with issues where, you know, you send children to schools, and unfortunately, in terms of resources, we send our children to multiracial schools, and there you are encouraged to speak English to your child, because your child's speech must be regulated. And of course, this is a very central characterization of blackness as a product of colonialism, what I mentioned earlier as the savage slot, you know, the savage slot, you know, the uglier other that must always be there. As I try to get to the conclusion of this, so when we talk about this idea, you know, this kind of very precarious, you know, position, it's a space that embraces, you know, the breaking up, you know, of what is considered normal. So this idea of fugitive listening, you know, comes there. It's kind of like, you know, a refusal of sort, you know, to stay and to be defined. You know, it provides a moment of embracing disorder, you know, as a reality and as a means to augment what, you know, is outside the scope of sensibilities and regimented others. And I think, again, to go back to the point, and I think that was the beauty of what was, you know, the discourse around Fees Must Fall, because again, these, you know, sensibilities, what we understood to be normal, what was comfortable, was suddenly disrupted by a very new, brash, you know, discourse that was very kind of very forceful in its approach to make us understand that things should not be the way that they are. So it moves away, you know, from, you know, approaches and kinds of dispels rigid notions of what counts and what does not count. And that particular discourse kind of operates from a very different logic of imagining a, you know, a very different world, of imagining very different kind of ways of being human. And I think, you know, the idea of the undercommons from, you know, Hani and Morton is really, you know, an idea that captures, you know, and embraces new and irregular constituencies that fall outside of or go beyond, you know, the idea of what is considered normal. So, and they write a lot about this idea of refusal, you know, and from a very, you know, kind of very intriguing perspective of music. And they make an argument that, you know, music happens prior to the artist picking up the instrument. You know, when you wait for the artist to actually get to the instrument, The anticipation, according to this kind of conceptualization, is also part of that music. So, and they state very clearly that, we refuse order as distinction between noise and music, chatter and knowledge, pain and truth, because I think they want us to operate from this idea of a continuum. And I think for us to understand the coloniality of being, we also need to operate from that perspective of a continuum or continuities, where we see how society continues to rely in some of the grammars that constituted what was colonialism, in terms of what we understand as knowledge, in terms of what we understand as our roles as scholars, what we understand as our role as of the university. It's very much still very much anchored around those particular notions. So today, as I conclude, the coloniality and language have implications for modern society in so many ways. And I think some of them I've touched on, and I'm hoping, you'll bring questions or comments that will help me return to some of the points, because a lot of this is linked to the politics of economics, structural dominance, which is still very much intact. And we see how the creation of modern society, still very much operates within, this logic of violence as a kind of very consistent, thread around how we understand ourselves in the world, how we understand our tonality of our languages, how we understand how we need to articulate some of these ideas, and what it means to articulate those ideas in a very particular way, which again, speaks to this politics of palatability, our comfort, what is acceptable, and all of that. And I think I'm hoping that I made sense in some of these, but I'm looking forward to the comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mphendukana, for that contribution to the topic and also just your overall offering. You brought about very important, points with regards to coloniality of race as it relates to language, how our languages are coded with power, how the use of language is coded with power, and how the colonial structures and strictures have almost took away so much from us, from our being, from the power of what we own through language itself, and how language persists to exist through, structural, institutional, and also everyday racism, especially in South Africa. You made very interesting examples using the fees must fall, and also, the comparison between different protests of Black people versus the protests of the white, and the style in response and the different, epistemic violences that come to be pinned with how the state or power reacts to Black people's protests, reacts to Black people's cries. I'm also just reminded of, the importance of language in this work that we're trying to do in our quest for decoloniality, as we come across these different theories and these different concepts that bring about language of understanding, or bring about language in terms of what we can point out of what we're experiencing, because it's one thing to know, to feel and experience something, but when you have the language to articulate what you're feeling, to articulate what you're experiencing, then it becomes, I guess, more manifested into combating against it. So thank you so much for that contribution. Thank you for sharing. We'll move to the Q&A. Ontepeng, you wanted to say something? Utepeng? No? Okay. All right, fellow travelers, it looks like we don't have any more questions or contributions to the conversation at this moment. So we'll move to the next item in our program, where it's also a musical piece prepared by one of our own, Thandiwe Kunene, who will also just, give us context of the piece and also just give a summary of what she then get it from a presentation got Dr. Mphendukana. So I'll play the song first, and then we will then open for her to speak.
I've been walking with my face turned to the sun, weight on my shoulders, a bullet in my gun. Well, I got eyes in the back of my head, just in case I have to run. I do what I can when I can, what I can for my people. While the clouds roll back and the stars fill the night, that's when I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. Can you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer? Gonna keep on keeping on. I can feel it in my bones. Early in the morning, before the sun begins to shine, we're gonna start moving toward the separating line. I'm wading through muddy water. You know I got a made up mind, and I don't mind if I lose any blood on the way to salvation. And I'll fight with the strength that I got until I die. So I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. And you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer. Gonna keep on keeping on. And I know what's around the bend might be hard to face 'cause I'm alone, and I just might fail, but Lord knows that I tried. Shine stars when I'm left. Stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. And you hear freedom calling, calling me to answer. Gonna keep on keeping on. I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home, far across the river. You hear freedom calling, calling me to answer. Gonna keep on keeping on. I'm gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are
Wow, thank you so much, Thandiwe, for sharing that item with us. I'm still not seeing people applauding and clapping, same thing, sending hearts, comments. I see some comments. Um, Asake says that was beautiful, and our prof also, Mphendukana, is also saying heart, 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 Tulufelo heart. Thank you so much, Thandiwe. I'd like to give you a platform to speak to us about this piece that you've chosen and also give reflections on Dr. Mphendukana's presentation with us today. There she is.
Hi, how are you?
You're good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm gonna start with speaking on what the guests were discussing earlier. I wrote this down because I'm a little bit sick right now, and but highlighting what our guest speaker spoke on, how we present ourselves in the public domain is often a colonized version of ourselves. There's a drastic difference compared to when we present our decolonized versions of ourselves, and as time passes and as we progress, we forget and it becomes easier way to pull away from our roots. With relation to the knowledge of African languages, I believe the opportunity to take African languages as non-compulsory modules in undergrad can be an aiding solution to the progress of decoloniality. Going into why I chose the song. Okay, sorry. I chose this song because it speaks about slavery, and slavery is a big part of who we are to this day. And I thought that it related very much to the theme of race. So I wrote down also notes on what I took from this, and yeah. So I'm going to read from those notes. It says, this song comes from the film Harriet, which is a story about an abolitionist, Harriet Tubman, and the movie was created 100 years after her passing. In the early 1800s, Harriet Tubman was born in Maryland. She managed to escape as a young adult by running for miles through fields and forests. Later on, she took a life-threatening risk and fled to Maryland to assist other slaves to escape through the Underground Railroad, which was a system of abolitionists and safe houses. The song Stand Up, which is written and sung by Cynthia Erivo, is from the movie in which Cynthia herself is actually the main character, playing the great Harriet Tubman herself. Her song gives life to the futures and themes of hope, overcoming challenges, and showing kindness towards others. Erivo, Erivo delivers the heart-rendering words in the performance at the Oscars, with tears running down her face at the end of the song singing, "Stand up, bring my people along, and together we're going." This song is a freedom song for the racial discrimination that still influences the lives of many racial groups today. This song is also a form of activism in itself for the challenges that we face in our current societies. I conclude with the quote by Avia herself. The song, for me, is a thank you to Harriet, an expression of hope, strength, and inspiration to do good for one another. It was very special to me to write a song that could share a bit of her history. Harriet deserves a million songs. So that's part of the reason why I chose the song, because it's a form of activism in itself, and it brings about change and helps in the decolonial process. So yeah.
Okay, we'll move to the next item of our program, where we'll have a closing summary of today's session um, from Danisha Moodley, who also be responding and also just giving reflections on the topic and also today's conversation. Danisha? There she is. Hi.
Vanakkam, good evening, Damalang and Priyanant, dear colleagues. the CHS team and honored guest speaker, Professor Mphendukana. I'd first like to thank the CHS team for this opportunity to share my expressions and thoughts on today's theme of coloniality of race. I am wary that the degree of my blackness may be under scrutiny, for I am an Indian by race. But what I would like to affirm is that the force of dehumanization based on non-whiteness is basically unavoidable to life, and it is to varying extents naturally. My point of departure is an expression over two lived experiences. It may be perceived as mild accounts in relativity. However, I must place the emphasis on the fundamental role that lived experience of blackness at any perceived level of intensity undoubtedly shapes the trajectory of one's life by means of where we position our authentic being. It takes on a very personal psychosocial standpoint, and I think this is reflective on the point that Professor Mphendukana had made. And through allowing ourselves to be vulnerable enough to share these experiences, can we build a community of deep-seated shared understanding founded on principles or values of empathy, true compassion, and with fired action to really effect the change that we want to work towards that egalitarian society that we so desire. Did you perm your hair at a salon? Asked the headmaster. My 11-year-old self was shocked, so deeply embarrassed, and left ashamed in front of my friends. Attending an Indian school with an Indian headmaster, I was just a little Indian girl with short and naturally curly hair, which was often likened to a version of an afro. My mother was infuriated after learning about the comment and had basically come into school and confronted the headmaster, only to be told that although it was my natural hair, it was inappropriate conduct, especially with my future appointment as the head prefect of the school, and would thus set a very poor example for other students. Ever since that day, I consciously grew out and tied my hair to meet the appropriate conduct. Once again, going back to the words of Professor, he had mentioned that we are products of colonization through coloniality, and that we have to maintain our position through to conforming to this palatable conduct. And basically, this is how I conditioned myself in this process. In retrospect, and having enrolled in this module, it is now so apparent and so evident that he, the headmaster, had actually allowed himself to submit to one of the streams of the double directory, which is white on black, to follow the conduct as deemed acceptable according to white supremacy. He ascribed to the universal world underpinned by colonialism. I then began to believe that the way I looked was actually unacceptable, engendering the belief that I was not good enough, and that prescribing and abiding by rules set by authorities in general was living the way of a respectable, good human being. If only, if only my then self was aware that disobedience with the right intention is very necessary to preserve your very being. And as we know it today, it is what we refer to as disrupting the status quo. And for example, a professor also mentioned the hashtag Fees Must Fall campaign. That was something back then we were all fearful of speaking our voices and wanting to be heard. Fanon also refers to the white gaze that we confront. And with my experience, I learned that it is sometimes not of the oppressive race, but that of your own race who defy their black being and submit to living the facade of whiteness. The other fixes me with his gaze, his gestures and attitude, the same way you fix a preparation with a dye. These are the words by Fanon, and which lead me to my second lived experience. It is 9 years post-apartheid, met by silent stares piercing my existence. I anxiously regretted my steps into the cafeteria, void of any racist comments, but just silent stares all around me. Just silent stares, oh, how loudly it shouts and assaults my very being. I feel like a spectacle, alienated and unworthy of being spoken to. I immediately become aware of the color of my skin. I was not like them. There we were, just 2 Indians and 3 Black students. It was a blackness among the dominant whiteness at the Pretoria Technikon Art Campus. We moved together in solidarity, never daring to walk alone or venture into the cafeteria, sharing in immense alienation by the whiteness that surrounded us. I could no longer exist in this space. Torture it would be to stay here just a day longer. I no longer wanted to be a graphic designer. The power of isolation, the power of silence through nonverbal communication. I was excluded, all because of the color of my skin, which spoke volumes of an untruth instituted by an inhumane colonialism. In that deciding moment, I killed my desire to be who I wanted to be, and so too imprisoned my Black being with shackles. I believed and truly saw myself as inferior to them. I left, never becoming a graphic designer. The racial undercurrents of our environment take a deep contextual shaping of our actions, beliefs, and thoughts. And the direction we take at the time under duress, anxiety, and fear impacts how we embrace our authentic being and the position we assume in the double directory of blackness, that being white on black or black for black. And as Steve Biko stated, the traditional inferior-superior black-white complexes are deliberate creations of the colonialist. My own very submission to this inferiority complex was a roadblock. So it had deprived me from the various opportunities and possibilities that I could grow my life into. Biko further iterates that this complex is basically a roadblock to true integration, and those suffering from this complex need to rid themselves of it in order to give rise, and I quote, to a very strong grassroots buildup of Black consciousness, such that Blacks can learn to assert themselves and stake their rightful claim, unquote. The decolonial horizon I envision is that we are one day joined in the metaphor of the spectrum of humanity, tied together in collaboration and appreciation of our differences. It is the very rainbow nation that we speak of. Just like colors in a spectrum, there is no superior color. All have its purpose and place. And when they all come together, they blend seamlessly at the edges and integrate, creating something far greater than its individual self. We then see the magnificent rainbow in the project of decoloniality. So let us blend into each other with appreciation for our individual uniqueness at the center, and then shared purpose and lived experience. I thank Dr. Professor Mphendukana for his invaluable insights. I think what he also mentioned was about the project of decoloniality, or learning in this module is not static. It's ever changing. So even in the space of education, what may hold for 5 years may become irrelevant in the next 5 years. And I think that is what shows us that in a project of decoloniality, we as human beings ties in very strongly to the element of human evolution. We are always progressing and progressing towards the betterment of humankind. Whereas colonialism holds humankind imprisoned, shackled, and static, without allowing creativity and self-expression. And I'd sincerely like to thank the CHS team for this beautiful module, which really helped me personally to reimagine the world. Like, for example, when I do step into a shop and suddenly notice the signboard is only in English and Afrikaans, it's like, am I stepping into a colonialist country back then, during apartheid times, or am I in a new South Africa? I see a lot of things anew, and I'm privileged to be part of this journey with all of you. And I thank you for your time and kindness in receiving my expression. Thank you. Ali.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Danisha, for sharing those reflections, and especially as you center yourself within how you understand coloniality of race and how you've been navigating and you've journeyed in this world that is so brutal, that is alienating, and that is, has put you as an outcast. And thank you for the two pieces of poetry that you shared with us that center around your own experiences. And thank you for also acknowledging and affirming this module, and acknowledging that you've been journeying with us. And we are also very much privileged to have had you this year, and we hope that every single one of you continues to journey with us. Even after you've graduated, you'll still be a part of this conversation, be a part of this learning. Thank you so much, Danisha. I'm just going to, before we close, just going to open